In the spring of 1987, at an estate sale outside of Pratt, Kansas, a 31-year-old farmer and part-time mechanic named Cleo Yancey paid $60 for 4 cardboard boxes of blown voltage regulators, cracked distributor caps, seized alternator cores, and 1 milk crate packed with assorted ignition points that nobody had touched since the Eisenhower administration. The auctioneer listed them as miscellaneous electrical, condition unknown, which was his polite way of saying he had no idea what was in the boxes and didn't want to find out. A scrap dealer from Kingman offered $5 for the lot and pulled his hand back when nobody matched him. The man running the estate, a nephew from Wichita who had driven down that morning in a clean pickup and was already thinking about lunch, told the auctioneer to just get rid of it. So the auctioneer did. $60. 4 boxes. 1 milk crate. Cleo Yancey loaded them into the bed of his truck without ceremony, drove the 40 miles back to Pratt County, and set them on the workbench in the shop behind his house. The story traveled the way all stories travel in small farming counties. From the estate sale to the co-op on Monday morning, from the co-op to the parts counter at the case dealer on Tuesday, from the parts counter to the diner on Wednesday, and from the diner to the church parking lot by Sunday. By the time it completed that circuit, Cleo Yancey had paid $60 for a pile of garbage that not even a scrap dealer wanted, and the consensus in Pratt County, Kansas, in the spring of 1987 was that he had lost his mind. His brother-in-law, Dale Fender, said as much to his face. "What in the world are you going to do with a box of burnt-up regulators?" Cleo said he'd figure something out. Dale said that wasn't an answer. Cleo said it was the only one he had right now. Dale shook his head and went back to his coffee. Let me tell you about Cleo Yancey, because what he did with those 4 boxes and that milk crate only makes sense if you understand who he was and what he'd been doing for the previous 15 years. Cleo was born in 1956 on a dryland wheat and milo operation outside of Iuka in the southwestern corner of Pratt County. His father, Harlan Yancey, farmed 640 acres and fixed everything himself, not because he was cheap, though he was careful with money, but because the nearest dealer was 40 minutes away, and a broken machine in the middle of harvest was a problem that couldn't wait 40 minutes. Harlan had built a shop behind the house in 1961, poured the concrete floor himself, framed the walls with lumber he'd salvaged from a collapsed grain bin on the Pruitt place, and put up a tin roof that drummed in the rain and turned the building into a furnace in July. He put a wood stove in the corner for winter. He built a workbench along the south wall from 2-inch oak planks, and above that workbench he mounted a pegboard that ran the full 12 feet. And on that pegboard he hung every tool he owned in the outline of its own shape, traced in black marker so he'd know at a glance if something was missing. He bought his first multimeter in 1963 from a Sears catalog, a triplet model that he kept in a leather case on the second shelf of the workbench, and he never let anyone borrow it. Harlan Yancey was not a machinist. He was not a trained electrician. He was a farmer who had decided, sometime in his 30s, that he was going to understand how things worked well enough to fix them himself, and he had spent the next 30 years making good on that decision. By the time Cleo was old enough to hand tools, Harlan could rebuild a carburetor, rewind a starter motor, diagnose a short circuit with a test light and a length of wire, and explain why a voltage regulator failed in terms that would have satisfied an electrical engineer, even if the language he used was entirely his own. He taught Cleo the same way he taught himself, by doing the work and explaining every step out loud, as if the explanation were part of the job. Cleo finished high school in 1974 and had a bus ticket to Wichita and a plan to study diesel technology at the Vocational Institute there. He'd saved the money himself, $400 in a coffee can in his room, and he had the application filled out on the kitchen table. Then his mother had a stroke in August, and Cleo put the application in the drawer and stayed. He never said he resented it. He never said much about it at all. He stayed because staying was what was needed. And Cleo Yancey was the kind of man who did what was needed without requiring it to be acknowledged. He farmed alongside his father through the late 1970s, took over more of the operation as Harlan's health declined, and when Harlan died in January of 1982, Cleo inherited a paid-for 640-acre farm, a shop full of tools, and a workbench with a triplet multimeter still in its leather case on the second shelf. He also inherited something harder to inventory, 15 years of working beside a man who believed that understanding a machine was the only honest relationship you could have with it. By 1987, Cleo was farming his father's land and doing electrical repair work on the side. Not officially. He didn't have a sign. He didn't advertise. But word had gotten around that if your tractor's charging system was acting up, or your combine's ignition was misfiring in ways the dealer couldn't diagnose in a single service call, you could bring it to Cleo Yancey's shop and he'd figure it out. He charged fair. He didn't guess. He used the triplet multimeter, and he didn't stop until he had an answer. Farmers in Pratt County trusted that. A few of them started leaving parts with him when they didn't know what else to do with them. A regulator they'd pulled off a tractor that was otherwise running fine. An alternator core from a machine they'd sold for parts. A box of ignition points from a dealer close out that turned out to be the wrong application. Cleo took them all and put them on the shelf above the workbench, and by the spring of 1987, that shelf had accumulated a collection of agricultural electrical components that would have stocked a modest parts store. That's the context for the $60 purchase. Not impulse, not eccentricity, research. Now let me tell you what Cleo Yancey actually saw in those 4 cardboard boxes, because it was not what anyone at the estate sale or the co-op or the diner thought he saw. The estate belonged to a man named Vernon Stallings, who had run a small engine and electrical rebuild shop out of his property in Pratt County for 32 years. Vernon had been the man you called when the dealer said your part was obsolete and the catalog didn't list a replacement. He rebuilt generators and alternators. He rewound armatures. He matched voltage regulators to charging systems that hadn't been in production since the Truman administration. He knew the cross-reference between every major agricultural electrical component manufactured between 1945 and 1975, and he kept that knowledge in a series of composition notebooks that he'd filled by hand over 3 decades, one entry at a time. When Vernon died in the fall of 1986, he had no children and no apprentice, and his nephew from Wichita, who had driven down that morning in a clean pickup and was already thinking about lunch, had no idea what any of it was worth. Cleo had known Vernon Stallings. Not well, but enough. He'd brought a generator core to Vernon's shop in 1979, and watched the old man diagnose it in 4 minutes with a growler and a test probe. He'd asked questions, and Vernon had answered them, and Cleo had gone home and written down everything he remembered. He knew what Vernon's shop had been. He knew what it had held. And when he saw the estate sale listed in the Pratt Tribune in March of 1987, he drove out 2 days before the sale to look at what was being offered. He didn't tell anyone he'd done that. What he found in those boxes was not junk. It was a cross-section of 32 years of agricultural electrical inventory, accumulated by a man who knew exactly what he was saving and why. The voltage regulators were blown, yes, but blown regulators can be rebuilt if you have the right components and the right knowledge. The alternator cores were seized, but seized cores can be freed, inspected, and rewound. The ignition points were old, but ignition points don't age on a shelf. They either fit the application or they don't, and if they fit, they work. What Cleo was actually buying for $60 was Vernon Stallings' 32 years of knowing which part fit which machine, organized into boxes that only looked like garbage to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. He also found, at the bottom of the third box, 9 of Vernon's composition notebooks. The nephew hadn't separated them from the parts. They'd been packed together, probably because whoever packed the boxes had assumed the notebooks were just scrap paper. Cleo found them under a layer of alternator cores and set them on the tailgate of his truck and read the first 3 pages of the first notebook, standing in the wind in the Stallings yard. Then he put them carefully in the cab, drove back to Pratt County, and paid $60 for everything else the following Saturday without changing his expression. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a man spend $60 on broken parts. They were watching a man acquire a 32-year education for $60 and a Saturday morning. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Cleo Yancey proved that the difference between a buyer and a builder is not skill. It's patience combined with the right question. He started in the evenings after the spring wheat was in. He took everything out of the boxes and laid it on the workbench in categories: regulators in one row, alternator cores in another, distributor caps by application, points by thread pitch and contact gap. He worked with Vernon's notebooks open beside him, cross-referencing each component against Vernon's handwritten catalog. Some of what he had was genuinely unusable. He set those pieces aside. But most of what he had was salvageable, and some of what he had was not just salvageable, but valuable. Components that the dealer catalogs had stopped listing years ago, but that farmers in Pratt County were still running on equipment they couldn't afford to replace. He rebuilt the voltage regulators first, because that's where the demand was highest. A voltage regulator failure on a tractor in the middle of wheat harvest is not a problem you defer. The battery drains, the machine dies, and you're sitting in a field. The dealer might have a replacement or might not. If the tractor is old enough, might not is the more likely answer. Cleo had the cores. He had Vernon's notebooks telling him the internal component values, and he had his father's workbench and his father's tools and 15 years of watching his father refuse to accept that something couldn't be fixed. He sourced solid-state conversion components from an electronics supplier in Wichita, paying $4 to $9 per regulator for the parts needed to convert mechanical regulators to solid-state units. The conversion made them more reliable than the originals. He did the first 6 on a test basis, bench tested each one against known good specifications from Vernon's notebooks, and then installed one on his own, Massey Ferguson 135, and ran it for 6 weeks before he offered any to anyone else. The alternator cores took longer. He sent 3 of them to a rewind shop in Hutchinson and watched how the work was done, asked questions, and brought the other 7 home to do himself. He bought a growler for $34 from a farm auction in Kingman County, the same type of instrument Vernon had used, and he taught himself armature, testing the way his father had taught him everything, by doing it and explaining every step out loud, even when he was alone in the shop. By the end of that first winter, Cleo had rebuilt 14 voltage regulators, rewound or inspected and cleared 11 alternator cores, sorted and cataloged 340 sets of ignition points by application, and cross-referenced everything against Vernon's notebooks until he had a working knowledge of the agricultural electrical systems in Pratt County that was, as far as he could determine, unmatched by anyone still operating in the county since Vernon Stallings had died. The $60 purchase, the components from Wichita, the growler from Kingman, miscellaneous supplies and test equipment. His total investment in the first year was $247. He didn't open a shop. He didn't put up a sign. He told 3 farmers he trusted that he had rebuilt regulators available for older equipment and that he could source ignition components for applications the dealer had stopped stocking. He told them what he charged, which was less than the dealer's price for new units when new units were available, and considerably less than the dealer's price when they weren't. He told them his work was guaranteed. Word moved the way it always moved in Pratt County, from the co-op to the parts counter to the diner, but this time it moved differently. This time it was farmers telling other farmers something they'd seen with their own eyes. Harlan Yancey's boy had rebuilt a Delco Remy regulator for an Oliver 88 that the dealer said couldn't be matched anymore, and the thing had run clean through wheat harvest without a hiccup. A farmer named Gus Reinhardt drove over from the east side of the county in June of 1988 with a John Deere 402. Oh, that had been throwing a charging fault for 2 seasons. 2 dealer service calls, no resolution. Gus had been told the charging system was original to the tractor, that the components were obsolete, and that the correct solution was a complete charging system upgrade at a cost he hadn't been willing to pay. He pulled into Cleo's yard without calling ahead, which was the custom in Pratt County, and found Cleo in the shop with the doors open. Cleo put the triplet on the 4020 system in 11 minutes and identified a voltage regulator that was intermittently failing under load, a failure mode that didn't show up at idle, which is why the dealer's diagnostic had missed it. He had a rebuilt replacement on the shelf that matched the application. He installed it, bench-tested the system under simulated load conditions using a carbon pile load tester he'd acquired from Vernon's estate, and had Gus back on the road in under 2 hours. He charged $28 for the regulator and $15 for the labor. Gus stood in the shop doorway for a moment before he got in his truck, looking at the shelf above the workbench, the rows of rebuilt units and labeled coffee cans, the composition notebooks open on the stand Cleo had built for them. He took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck. "You do all this yourself?" Gus said. "Most of it," Cleo said. "Some of it was Vernon Stallings." Gus nodded slowly. He put his cap back on. He said, "Your dad would have thought that was about right. Cleo said he thought so too. If you've ever watched a community underestimate someone for years, and then watched that same community go quiet when the proof arrived, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 15 years, because this is where the story stops being about voltage regulators and starts being about something else entirely. The 1988 drought hit Pratt County, the way it hit most of the southern plains, hard and without apology. Wheat yields dropped by half in some fields and to nothing in others. Farmers who had borrowed against projected yields to buy new equipment found themselves making payments on machines that hadn't earned their keep. The ones who had financed operating costs on a line of credit found the line called in early. The ones who had built their operations on the assumption that last year's commodity prices would hold found that assumption was not a foundation. Cleo Yancey's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. He owned his land. He owned his equipment, his electrical repair work charged on completion, and was paid in cash or check, never on credit extended to the customer. His input costs were real, and he paid them from savings. When the drought cut his wheat yield to 40% of normal, it hurt. But it didn't threaten the land. He watched his neighbors through that period not with satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about watching a family lose a farm their grandfather had broken sod on, but with a quiet sadness that he didn't express to anyone. He understood what had happened to them, not because they were bad farmers, because they'd built their operations on borrowed money and borrowed time, and when both ran out at once, there was nothing left to stand on. 3 farms in the eastern half of Pratt County went to auction between 1988 and 1991. One of them was the Reinhardt Place, 480 acres that Gus's family had farmed since 1923. Gus had taken out a second operating loan in 1986 to finance a new combine, and when 2 consecutive short crops followed by a price collapse hit simultaneously, the math stopped working. The bank held the note. The auction was in October of 1990. Cleo was there. He sat in the back of the crowd and didn't bid on the equipment, which went for prices that would have seemed low in any other year. He waited. When the land came up, 480 acres in 2 parcels, the opening bid from the bank's representative set the floor at $180 per acre. The speculators from Wichita bid it to $210. A land company from out of state came in at $220. Cleo raised his hand at $230. He bought both parcels, 480 acres, at $230 per acre, $110,400, paid by check drawn on an account at the Pratt County State Bank that had been accumulating since 1982. Fed by 8 years of careful farming, minimal debt, and the steady income from a rebuilt regulator business that had started with $60 and 4 cardboard boxes, and a milk crate of ignition points that nobody else had wanted. The crowd went quiet when Cleo's final bid was accepted. Not politely quiet. Not the quiet of people waiting for the next item. The quiet of people rearranging everything they thought they knew about a man they'd been mildly amused by for 3 years. Dale Fender was standing 6 people to Cleo's left, and he didn't say a word for the rest of the afternoon. Cleo shook the auctioneer's hand, signed the paperwork at a folding table set up beside the barn, and drove home. He was back in the shop by 4 o'clock. Gus Reinhardt stopped by the following spring, after the planting was done on what had been his family's land and was now Cleo's. He stood in the yard for a moment before he came to the shop door, and Cleo could see him working through something. Gus came inside and looked at the workbench and the shelf of rebuilt units and the composition notebooks in their stand. He said, "I want you to know I don't hold it against you." Cleo said he understood. Gus said, "I should have asked you to look at my books the way you looked at my charging system." Cleo thought about that for a moment and said, "The fault was intermittent, hard to catch at idle." Gus almost laughed. He said that was about the kindest way anyone had put it to him. They shook hands and Gus left, and Cleo went back to the regulator he'd been rebuilding when Gus pulled in. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Harlan Yancey would have understood without a word of explanation. Cleo farmed 1,120 acres through the 1990s, his original 640 in the Reinhardt ground, and he kept the shop running on evenings and weekends the way he always had. He never hired help for the electrical work. He trained his nephew, a boy named Travis Yancey, who was 14 in 1994, and who had started coming to the shop after school, the way Cleo had started coming to his father's shop, because the work was interesting and the man doing it was worth watching. Cleo put Travis on the growler first, the same way Harlan had put him on the multimeter first, because the diagnostic instrument is where you learn to ask the right question before you reach for a part. Travis learned to read Vernon Stallings' notebooks. He learned the cross-reference between every major agricultural charging system manufactured between 1945 and 1980. He learned why a mechanical regulator fails under load and why the solid-state conversion is more reliable and how to bench test a rebuilt unit before it goes on a machine that somebody's depending on. By 1998, Travis was doing most of the rebuild work himself, and Cleo was mostly farming and occasionally answering questions. The shop behind the house still had Harlan's pegboard on the south wall, every tool in the outline of its own shape, traced in black marker. The triplet multimeter was still in its leather case, on the second shelf of the workbench. The wood stove still worked. The tin roof still drummed in the rain. In the fall of 2001, the Pratt County Farm Bureau asked Cleo to speak at their annual meeting. He was 45 years old and had been farming Pratt County ground for 20 years and fixing Pratt County electrical systems for 15. And he had a reputation by then that was different from the one he'd had in 1987. He was not famous. He was not wealthy by any measure that would have impressed anyone from Wichita. But in a county of a few hundred farming operations, he was the man who had bought the Reinhardt ground with cash in 1990, while everyone else was selling, and that fact had not been forgotten. He spoke for about 8 minutes. He didn't use notes. He said that he had learned 2 things from his father that had shaped every financial decision he'd made as an adult. The first was that a machine you understand is a machine you own, and a machine you don't understand is a machine that owns you. The second was that the difference between what something costs to buy and what it costs to build is the difference between what you pay and what you keep. He said he'd paid $60 for 4 boxes of parts in 1987, that everyone in the county had laughed at, and that those 4 boxes had paid for a portion of the Reinhardt ground 3 years later. Not directly, but in the way that every dollar you don't spend stays in the account, earning the right to be spent when the right thing comes available. He said, A paid-for shop and a paid-for farm are the only things a bank can't take from you. Everything else is just borrowing time. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment before the applause started, and in that moment Dale Fender, who was sitting in the third row, looked at his brother-in-law and nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's acknowledging something he should have understood a long time ago. "Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at 4 cardboard boxes of blown voltage regulators and a milk crate of ignition points at an estate sale in Pratt County, Kansas? Most people see garbage. Most people see the leftovers of a dead man's shop, sorted and loaded by a nephew who is already thinking about lunch. Cleo Yancey saw 32 years of accumulated knowledge packed into cardboard, available to anyone patient enough to read it. He saw the cross-reference between every agricultural charging system in the county. He saw the unmet need that Vernon Stallings had served for 3 decades and that nobody had stepped in to fill since Vernon died. He saw $60 standing between him and an education that would have cost years and thousands anywhere else. That's the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds. $60, 4 cardboard boxes, 9 composition notebooks, and a milk crate of ignition points that not even the scrap dealer from Kingman wanted. The foundation of 480 acres of paid-for Kansas ground and a shop that still runs on weekday evenings. The triplet multimeter still in its leather case. The tools still in the outlines of their own shapes on the pegboard that Harlan Yancey mounted on the south wall in 1961. The notebooks still open on the stand, and a 19-year-old named Travis Yancey asking the right question before he reaches for a part.